3 ganger avkastning på børsen over tid. Har jeg nå fått oppmerksomheten din? Jeg regner med det. Resten av dette webinaret vil bli holdt på engelsk. Welcome to Great Place to Work and to our webinar, Culture as Competitive Advantage, Why You Should Invest in Culture and Leadership. My name is Marianne Køyen-Persen. Increasingly more executives and managers across levels are now understanding the correlation between culture and their business performance. Studies, both nationally and internationally, shows that culture drives business productivity, business performance, and creates and delivers superior results. I started off this webinar by referencing a study conducted on the Fortune 100 list in the United States. This is Great Place to Work's list over the top 100 companies to work for within the United States. And that study shows that if you put $1 on the best workplaces, you will gain a 3 times return on that investment over time. Professor Alex Edmans of London Business Schools, he has also been able to show in his studies that the good workplaces are more profitable over time. So we are now able to show that it is trust-based culture that drives your business performance. Culture is therefore your main competitive advantage, and that is why you should invest in culture and leadership. And we in Great Place to Work, we can help you do so. Great Place to Work's methodology is the only methodology that is able to directly show the correlation between high score and superior financial results. So when we in Great Place to Work help companies develop their competitiveness, we do this in 3 ways. Firstly, by providing measurements that creates insight and analysis into 1, the workplace culture, where we create this insight by using the world's most commonly used employee survey, the Trust Index. 2, leadership practices, where we evaluate the leadership practices through the strategic framework of culture audit. And 3, leadership effectiveness, where we evaluate leadership effectiveness through gap analysis that links the leadership practices and the employee experience. So, firstly, measurements that create insight and analysis. Secondly, we help to ensure movement and progression through good process design, support, and training. We support leadership development, strategy development, and transformation. So firstly, measurements. Secondly, process design. And then thirdly, we recognize, acknowledge, and celebrate those that succeed through our Great Place to Work certification and the best workplace lists. This is the list that I mentioned earlier on in this webinar with the Fortune 100 list. So culture, as your main competitive advantage, has effects on the business, the employees, and also the society. In his recent book, Grow the Pie, Professor Alex Edmans from London Business School says that great companies delivers both purpose and profit. Companies that improve their working conditions for its employees gain more motivated and productive employees. So we in Great Place to Work, we've been fortunate to be working closely with Mr. Edmans for years. And we feel so honored that he's here with us today. So for the remaining of this hour, my good colleague Trond Kleivane will sit down with Mr. Edmans to discuss today's topic further. So please enjoy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Alex. Can you hear me?
I can, Trond. Thank you to you and Marianne for the invitation to be here. It's great to do so.
Thank you for being with us, Alex. We've been looking forward to this conversation. At least I have, and I'm sure that all the participants around, both in Norway and international globally, do the same. First of all, congratulations with what I would call a fantastic book. I've read it, and I think it should be mandatory for all leaders, and not only in business, but investors. Of course, you're from the financial side yourself, so you have a lot of compelling, good arguments there, but also for policymakers and politicians. I really think it's an extraordinary book. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the comments. And it was the Great Place to Work survey that Mariana mentioned, which is the evidential underpinning behind the book, to show that the idea of delivering higher returns through workers is not just wishful thinking, it's backed up by the evidence.
And that's what's so great. So we also recognize your contribution to what we're doing. So thank you very much. Just to curiosity, what's the reason behind, why do you need to write this book? What was your driver?
It was for business leaders and also investors, because often they would say, yes, we care about wider society, we care about how we treat our workers, but they might not put it into practice genuinely when the rubber hits the road, because there's the view that if we focus too much on employees, it's at the expense of shareholders. So many leaders have this pie splitting mentality that the value that their company creates is a pie, so anything that they give to workers is at the expense of profits. And we've even seen this, right? So last year, we saw a number of CEOs sign the Business Roundtable statement on how they were going to care about wider society, but many of them actually didn't put it into practice because they thought, well, this is just going to be reducing our profits. And even right now in the pandemic, people might think, well, caring about employees, that's a luxury. We don't have money for that. And indeed, one of the people that I was writing the book for was my own profession of finance, because often within an organization, it's the finance people who are often the opponents of purpose-led initiatives, of focusing on workers, because they think it's at the expense of financial returns. I wanted to show that even for hard-headed finance and business people, that human capital is something which is necessary for long-term commercial success.
Yeah, and that's why it's such an interesting book. You make that bridge and you have it well documented. But what would be then the main message? You had it there, but we have more than 300, mostly business leaders attending this conversation. So what would be your main message to them? If you just summarize that from the start here, and they sit and they are eager to get the core.
Yeah, so I'd say that the overriding message is not to view the value that the company creates as being a fixed pie, but it's one that can be grown through investing in stakeholders. So we often have this view that, well, when we want to think about stakeholders or serving society, we might want to do the minimum possible. So there are companies that will pay the minimum wage, or charge as high prices as possible to customers, or squeeze their suppliers. And that indeed is the most profitable action in the short term. But in the long term, it backfires, and in fact, an approach which prioritizes stakeholders, that's something which is linked to long-term returns. But here's the important nuance. So often people think, okay, well, what Alex says, that sounds great, but really we just don't have money in order to invest in our workers. So in the short term, particularly in a pandemic, that's something which is expensive. We can't just double people's wages or launch a free gym. But what I want to stress is actually treating workers well. Often that involves an attitudinal shift, not just a financial expenditure. And indeed, that's why, indeed, culture is such a powerful comparative advantage. It's something that competitors can't replicate simply by throwing money at a problem. So a lot of the things that are surveyed in the culture audit that Mariana mentioned, those are things which are the attitudes of managers. So do they genuinely see their employees as people rather than just factors of production? How much do they try to develop meaningful work and empowerment and so forth? So it's not just an issue that you can think about when you've got lots of money, it's realistic, even in a time of crisis, for people to think carefully about how they're managing their employees. So it's both number one, commercially important for the long term, and it's also number two, it's feasible even when you're financially constrained.
You talk about purpose as a driver to achieve this. This different way of looking at, the pie and growing the pie and increasing productivity. And purpose, whereas it is understood, you put it much more in the driver's seat. Can you elaborate on that and why purpose is so important as a driver, and how to make it concrete enough, tangible enough to be used as the compass or the driver for the company?
Absolutely. And actually, before I argue for why purpose is important, let me play devil's advocate to myself. So there are some people who would argue that a company doesn't need purpose because as long as it focuses on long-term profit, with the emphasis on long term, it will still invest in workers because it will know that, well, if they don't treat their workers fairly, they will leave. If they don't train their workers, they're going to be less productive. So there is a view, which Milton Friedman famously wrote about 50 years ago, that it's actually fine for a company to focus on profit, at least long-term profit, because that will force you to treat your workers well. But the problem with that is that works in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. So why does it work in theory? So what have finance professors like me have emphasized for the last 50 years is that when you make a decision, you do a calculation. So when you build a factory, you can calculate how many widgets will that factory produce, how much will I sell those widgets for, and I can think about how much money I'm going to make. But you can't do that with employees, right? So if I'm to think about, well, if I give my employees more parental leave, or if I give my employees more delegate more autonomy, how much more productive they will be and how much more money I can make, that's really, really difficult. You just can't do that calculation. So what is purpose? Purpose is not being driven by calculations and long-term profit. It's you're going to do something because it's the right thing to do. So a company that's driven by purpose thinks, I'm going to treat my workers well, not because they're going to be more productive and make me more money, but because I want to treat my workers as my colleagues, as humans, and the right way to treat them is to give them parental leave, is to unleash their underlying drive and motivation by delegating to them, and so forth. And that goes beyond a financial calculation. It allows you to do many more investments than you would have done if you had to justify everything with a financial calculation. Now, on the flip side, right, a company just can't do everything and make every single investment. But again, the power of purpose is that it focuses the company on knowing what are the investments to take. So there's one company which their purpose might be to focus a lot on innovation, let's say Reckitt Benckiser. And so there the culture will be a lot of that. There might be another company, let's say a company which focuses more on efficiency, where it needs more coaching and guidance and maybe a little less delegation, and therefore be focused on that. But where the purpose helps you is it shows you what you should be focusing on when you choose to try to implement a culture within the organization.
Yeah, but it sounds like music in the ears of what we're working on in Great Place to Work, as you know. And you're also then following up on that. And the reason for the purpose being so important is, it seems to me that you are focusing even more on people as strategy. I mean, the importance and the drive and the necessity of having each employee taking part in both producing culture and profit. So whereas people have been treated as a resource, important resource always, it seems to me you go a step further, and that this is the strategic fundament. Each employee is a strategic fundament for being able to create both culture, purpose, profit. Is that so? Is it each and every one that has, let's say, a more importance than it had, in the old days, in the traditional way? And if so, why is this?
Absolutely. And if you think about the term human resources, right, historically, people thought human resources, right, where the focus was on people on resources. But what this highlights is the focus should be on human as people, as our colleagues. And you might think, well, that's obvious to everybody who's on this webinar because we understand the importance of treating employees as colleagues. But why is this so radical? And why is this such a shift from what people thought about before? And why are still some companies not getting it right? Why did I need to write the book? Well, if you think about some of the most powerful management innovations of the 20th century, it was to get more out of people as if they were resources that you just needed to squeeze. So let's think about, for example, the assembly line of Ford. So Ford was able to mass produce cars by setting up the assembly line, and that forced people to keep up with the pace of production. So the idea was that employees were naturally lazy. If you didn't command them, control them enough, they would shirk. The assembly line was a technological innovation to make sure that workers worked. And you didn't just have that technology, you also had this in the way that we evaluated and rewarded employees. We would count the number of widgets they would produce. We would pay them $1 per widget. We would motivate them by money. And you might think, well, is this an extreme view that I have? Isn't that something for 100 years ago? But in fact not. So even today, that's how we treat our employees. So I used to be an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. And how did the bosses get their reputation? The bosses who were known to squeeze as much out of their workers were known as the best bosses. So there's one day I was in the office once and I was laughing. And my vice president said, "Alex, you should not laugh when you're in the office." And I asked him why. And he said, "Well, if you're too happy, my managing director will think I'm not a good boss. I'm not working you hard enough." And so indeed, even in 2020, there's a lot of organizations who think their goal is to micromanage, is to make sure that they squeeze as much out of workers as possible. But what I wanted to highlight was a shift in thinking. So it's not that managers have all the brains and employees just execute their orders. Instead, well, actually employees, sometimes they are much closer to the action. They can propose a number of innovations. And I gave a lot of examples in the book of companies where there were major innovations proposed from employees. And also, it's not that employees are naturally lazy. And if you give them delegation, they're going to abuse that. Actually, employees are inherently driven to contribute, particularly if the firm is purposeful and they believe in the company's mission. And indeed, we've seen this in the pandemic. So the pandemic's obviously been really bad for a number of reasons, but if there was one silver lining about treatment of workers, it's that employees can work from home and they can be trusted and they will still contribute to the organization. And hopefully once we are through the other side and perhaps going to the office is fine, we might still be willing to allow some employees to work from home and give them flexibility. And that would also have, I think, a big implication for gender parity if indeed you're not always having to be in the office or travel all the time if you've got a young family. So hopefully that is something that will stay, is the acknowledgement that we can trust our workers, they're closer to the action, and also they may have some ideas that management, which are so far away, won't be able to see.
Much of this, or the lack of, let's say, focus and what still is not working, is due to what you could call the trap of measurement, the trap of reporting and communicating. Because a lot of what the things you're talking about, when you talk about how it used to be and still is, talking about human resources, has to do with what we can measure. So it seems to me we are caught in our own limitation regarding measuring and getting focus on the right stuff to be able to see humans not as resources but as humans, and to exploit the full potential and their own drive and inner motivation to drive. And as well, we don't know exactly, but Peter Drucker has gotten the honor of at least supposedly having said that, well, what get measured get managed. So somehow you need to measure to be able to discuss, communicate, report, focus. And we are often measuring things that are easy to measure. And Now we talk about humans and their potential. We talk about trust. We talk about motivation. We talk about how teams work, etc., and purpose. These are not easy things to measure, and managers seems to have a tendency to focus on things that are measurable. So what do you do about this lack of ability to get a grip on what is core here and make that manageable?
Yeah, this is really important. I see Rune has mentioned in the chat, what are the 3 top tips for moving the company in the direction you're describing? And I say one of them would be this, to move away from measurement. So it might seem sort of brazen for me to overturn a luminary like Peter Drucker, but I would actually disagree with him. I wouldn't say what gets measured gets done. I would say what gets monitored gets done, because monitoring is far more than just measurement. Measurement's about quantitative factors, monitoring is about qualitative factors. So let's give some examples. So typically we've thought of measurement as being financial measurement. So this is the problem with accounting and finance people. That's why I, as a finance person, wanting to acknowledge that actually the financial measures that investors and managers have looked at in the past, those are incomplete. But I would say even those who recognize the importance of wider society, they still focus too much on measures. So you might have seen the European Commission came out a couple of months ago with this argument that we need to measure human capital metrics. The big 4 accountancy firms came out, I believe, yesterday, arguing we need to measure human capital metrics. And some of them might seem sensible, like you want to measure wages, you want to measure the number of new jobs created, you want to measure employee turnover. But still, that's a very incomplete picture, because many of the key dimensions are qualitative, like providing meaningful work to employees. That's not captured in number of jobs or pay, giving them the opportunities to step up, creating a culture where you're allowing a dissent and different viewpoints and so forth. And that's why when I chose to write my study 15 years ago on the importance of human capital, I went with the best great place to work for study. I could have got these measurable numbers of pay and employee turnover, and those are still important, but I think we need to recognize that to monitor human capital, we need to look at things which are beyond just quantitative numbers. And that is difficult for the mindset of many measures. So to Runa's question, it's to understand that we want to look beyond even quantitative non-financial measures and realize that sometimes an assessment would involve actually just going down to the shop floor and seeing people in action. And that's something that investors in particular don't like, right? Investors want to be able to evaluate a company by putting something like employee turnover or pay ratios into a spreadsheet and monitor it at arm's length. But I think that's as crazy as hiring a new worker by looking at their test scores and looking at their social media profiles and using some artificial intelligence. You still need to interview them in order to figure out whether they're a good fit. And similarly for an investor to figure out whether a company genuinely has a strong workplace, yes, some measures will still be partially informative, like employee turnover, but I think you need to supplement that by actually going down and meeting the people. And indeed, some of the legendary investors, like Peter Lynch, if he was to invest in a retail store, he would go to the store and see how employees were being treated. And that's something that you cannot capture with quantitative measures, but you can certainly monitor.
But there you're pointing at the role of leadership and managers at the individual level in the company to be close enough to monitor the reality of the human capital in his team or her team. And this is not so easy to report on, communicate on, or even understand for the individual manager. And it's the forces from investors and others, and the traditional way of looking at this is based on the regular measurements. So how do you make room for this type of monitoring that is qualitative and where you have to engage managers on all levels to do these things to improve productivity? Because it is productivity, but it seems still to be difficult, or at least not self-evident, to introduce this in the daily life and of business. And still, this is something that is not common. So how do you do this monitoring and get the company to grasp this from top to bottom?
I think it's two things. I think one is to bring the leadership to the employees, and the other is to bring the employees to the leadership. So let me go through these two things in turn. So one of them, to bring the leadership to employees, is to make sure that leaders don't just sit in their C-suite, but actually see firsthand what's happening at ground level. So Simon Marks, who was the chairman of Marks and Spencer, the UK high street store, he famously required all top executives to walk the shop floor to see how customers and workers were being treated. And one day, this is back in the 1930s, on one of his own visits, he saw a shop assistant faint. And he was concerned, he wanted to find out why, and he learned that it was because her husband was unemployed, and therefore she was eating less at home so that her family had enough food. And so Simon Marks was shocked. He thought, I don't want to run a company where employees are fainting because they don't have enough to eat. So he launched a policy to provide free food for the employees, which was nutritious. And so that, had he not himself seen the effect that perhaps a lack of food had on the employees, he would have never thought that employees on a reasonable wage would have been in this trouble. And so that's an example of a manager. And indeed, right now, the Financial Reporting Council, which is the UK regulator, they encourage boards to walk the shop floor, to have site visits, so that they understand what is actually going on at the ground level. The second one is to bring the workforce to management. And so this might involve a number of ways in which management will be able to find out from the workers what's happening. So this might be some employee panels or employee town halls where you have employees which are sharing their voice. Alternatively, it may be that you task certain groups for finding out how the company is operating on a daily basis. So Novo Nordisk, for example, the pharmaceuticals firm, that has a strong set of ethical values, but it also needs to make sure, are these being put in place? So it has what they call ethics correspondence, and what they do is they'll observe each business unit in action. They will report some trends to management as to whether this is actually being put in place. So I would say, to Runa's question, what is a second top tip is to try to make sure that you don't have this divide between management and leadership. And so one way to do that is you have perhaps these employee town halls or these ethics correspondence, or management sometimes for themselves seeing what it's like to be in the company, to make sure that it's not them versus us, but it's management and employees together.
One of the problems with this, though, is that the managers that mostly needs to see this had huge blind spots. I mean, we are measuring blind spots in Great Place to Work, and this is one of the things we find looking at both top level and medium manager, etc. The lack of having, like your example with Marks and Spencer, where you cover up for your blind spot by walking around and being present, and suddenly you discover that you had a blind spot, which was huge and has huge ramifications. And how do you get people to recognize or be curious about these blind spots, and to want to reach down and understand that, in fact, what they see is not reality, because they're having these blind spots. They are not enough part of the culture, as your example showed. So, how do you create curiosity and a need or a willingness to move from the management perspective side to recognize and look for these blind spots?
So I think it's two things. So I think it's first to highlight the criticality of employees to an organization. And so this is something where some CEOs still don't think their workers are a CEO level issue. They think it's an issue for the HR director, which they can delegate. And indeed, there's a leading investor in the UK, and she will ask CEOs, tell me about your people, tell me about their concerns, tell me about what you're doing to address them. And she says some CEOs can answer, and other CEOs will say, I didn't know that you're going to ask me about my people. next time I'm going to bring along the HR director. So I do think it's partly will be investors to hold management to account for showing this is a CEO level issue. The board of directors should also make sure that the top management team knows it's not just the HR director. So number one is to highlight the criticality. And so that's another reason why I wanted to write the book, is to say employees are not just an optional extra that you should worry about in an upswing and when they're getting hired away. These are people which are relevant in all conditions. And I think the second thing is to recognize that, yes, let's say you know that employees are important. The second thing is to acknowledge the importance of blind spots and to say, well, if you are to recognize that employees are important, part of this involves knowing that you have these behavioral biases. So while I think many people on this webinar might know my TEDx talk, the social responsibility of business, on the importance of employees, they might not know my TED talk, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World, which is on confirmation bias, and actually the fact that you do have these blind spots. If you were to just receive reports from middle management which go up, you might agree with stuff that you might believe stuff that you agree with, and you might just disagree with stuff that doesn't confirm to what you say. So one of the ways of addressing the blind spots is the criticality of yourself seeing firsthand actual things, and this will actually try to contradict. So I think it's to acknowledge the fact that you will have blind spots and to try to take active action to address that.
But this is something, what you do is to put financial measures and financial arguments supporting what you would agree is common sense. I mean, this is a lot of, we know this in the small picture, but we seem not to be able to translate it into, let's say, the wider world or the organization. But we know this, as you say, humans are humans. They're not just resources, etc. But it's still difficult to translate. So why is there such a resistance? Because why is this not common? Why do you need to have this book? Why should we have many more books? Why is it not more common to follow up and to work along these lines, since it's basically just proving that common sense is real?
I'd say it's three reasons. I'd say number one is when you say we know this, you're right. I'd say you know this, and all the people on this webinar know this, because these are a selection of people who know the importance of purpose. But there's still a lot of people who don't. They still think it's an optional extra. If you think about the terms used to describe human capital, they will often say this is non-financial information. Right? And that to me sounds crazy, because what my research suggests is that it's financially material on the long term. Even if you're an investor and all you care about is making as much money as possible, you should take into account how workers are being treated. It's not just for socially responsible investors. And indeed, even think of the United Nations, which I really agree with. The United Nations has this thing called the Principles of Responsible Investment. And it says the principles of responsible investment are that you should think about these ESG factors, including human capital. But why do we need the word responsible there? Well, these are the principles of investment. Right? Any investor needs to take this into account. So I think the first reason is it is still not mainstream. There's still a lot of hard-headed businessmen and businesswomen who don't think this is important. The second thing is that even if you do think it's important, you're hampered by this horizon issue, is that many CEOs are evaluated according to short-term measures, such as quarterly profits, and therefore, even if they think, yeah, we know that in the long term, treating our workers better will pay off, they will think, well, we just can't wait around for the long term because we're beholden to quarterly earnings. So what I also focus on the book is the importance of having long horizons for how we pay executives, for how we evaluate companies as investors. So we need a system-wide change. We can't just blame the managers and say, you are not investing enough in people, because if investors are not looking beyond short-term profit, then there's no comfort for the manager to do so. I think the third thing is the most nuanced, is that when they think about the importance of companies being purposeful and serving wider society, employees, the environment, customers, suppliers, they think, well, this is all overwhelming, right? I just can't serve everybody. Right, there's so many problems in the world. There's the pandemic, there's climate change, there's automation, there's inequality. I, as a company, can't serve everybody. But so one of the surprising things about the book is I say, well, purpose involves not serving everybody. You don't need to serve all of the company's problems. You should just focus on a couple of things and do them really well. And that's actually quite counterintuitive. Like the Business Roundtable statement last year said we're going to serve customers, employees, and society and the environment and so on. But if you think about a person's purpose, it would never to be, I want to be a doctor and a lawyer and a teacher and a banker and entrepreneur. You might choose one of those things. And similarly for a company, it may well be there's certain companies which will focus on their employees, even if that is at the detriment of customers. So Southwest Airlines, for example, they've clearly defined their purpose as putting employees above all else. When you might think, well, they're a customer-focused organization, shouldn't they put customers first? Well, actually, no, they put employees first. So if that might mean that sometimes then you're not going to give in to a rude customer, even if they are generating revenue, that you might give employees sort of more flexible working conditions, even at the expense of customers, that's something different. And even if you're, let's say, a professional services firm, well, it may well be that you're going to say, well, even if the client wants my employees to work over the weekend, I'm going to push back because I think that employees are important. So there might be certain organizations which realize, actually, no, I don't need to do everything. I'm going to just focus on doing a couple of things really well. And then if I was to go to the third thing, Runa was asking for, what were the 3 top tips of moving the company in the direction you're describing, is to recognize that purpose involves being focused and targeted, and actually not being all things to all people. You don't need to solve all of the world's problems, but to recognize where is your comparative advantage and to concentrate on that.
But still, doing that and concentrating on that, you introduce and use the term social value, social profit. In the book, being the stakeholders. So you have to have this perspective of social profit or the wider range of effects that you have on the stakeholders in society as part of your thinking when looking at the purpose. Could you explain why it's so important to bring in, even if you don't select all of it, but still bring in your thinking to have this much wider scope than that that was something that was, let's say, 20 years ago, was quite in the Milton Friedman school. That's not something you would introduce as part of your scoping, but you do that very strongly. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think it's the idea that if you have social value or social purpose as your objective, that will free you to doing many things that you would not do otherwise if financial profit was your objective. For example, this conversation today is, I'm not being paid for the conversation, so I might think, well, if my goal was to maximize my income, I wouldn't come on this webinar here. But my purpose is not to maximize my income. It's the creation and dissemination of knowledge. It's to use research to influence the practice of business. And it's an absolute pleasure for me to be able to speak to all of these business leaders about the importance of employees. Now, it might be that down the road, some of these people might invite me to speak at the company and give a paid talk on something, but I'm never doing that calculation. I'm doing this because I love disseminating research to this audience. And similarly, that's the same for a company, right? It may well be that a company chooses to treat its employees well. They might choose to allow a junior employee to go to a meeting and present when maybe the senior might think, well, I should do this. And they're not going to do this calculation, oh, well, if I do this, then the employee is going to be more productive and so on. They might just do it because it's the right thing to do. But then unexpectedly, down the line, this pays off in some ways that you could have never expected. So I think it's the importance of freeing yourself from always using this calculation approach and instead using the intrinsic approach. And then what my book shows is that even if you're being motivated by social value, not by profit, you might actually make more profit in the long term because it frees you to taking these actions that you might not have taken otherwise.
How do you introduce that perspective on the board level? You know, in most traditional businesses, sitting in in the old paradigm, the old structures, and in the top management group? How do you introduce that perspective as part? I mean, most people can understand the perspective of purpose, because that's something that we've been, you know, more or less used to, and it can be more or less well thought through, and also values. Many can look at values without really going into it in the way that you are suggesting, for it to become an intrinsic part of the culture and the business of the company. And this is hard. So it's hard, both this societal, social profits, this value. I mean, all of these things are hard to introduce on the board level. You point at investors as the one that should look for it, because they will have high return over time. But most managers in most companies are not only driven, or at least they don't have the interaction. If they are listed, they might have, but many investors are not where you are, and they will not ask for this. So what would be your, let's say, your thoughts on how to introduce this on the board level and top management level?
Absolutely. So I think this is critical. So I think one of the important things is for the whole board to have responsibility for purpose. So the European Commission, in its report a couple of months ago, suggests there should be a chief purpose officer on the board. I think that's a terrible idea, because I think the entire board should be responsible for purpose. It's not something that we can delegate to a subcommittee. So for the board to take ownership of purpose. And so one example is like EQT Ventures, right? For example, they're an investor in Scandinavia, and they have the entire board sign their purpose statement. Now you might think, okay, they signed the statement, but how do they actually put it into practice? Well, there are some boards which do not allow the management team to present a proposal to the board, let's say a merger or a change in strategy or a big investment, unless they explain how is this consistent with the firm's purpose. So that's important, because traditionally, when you put something to the board, you do the financial analysis and you explain why this is going to create value for shareholders. But there are boards which will say, no, you need to have a purpose evaluation as part of this. Why is it that this is furthering the company's purpose? So that would be how to actually put into practice. Another thing is that boards will have these strategy away days. So they might spend 1 or 2 days per year thinking about strategy. Again, those strategy away days should be grounded in purpose. I think purpose is the destination. The strategy is how to get there. And so you can't really think about strategy unless you've thought about purpose to make sure that this is a grounding. And then I think another thing will be to try to come up with metrics or monitoring ways to figure out whether the company is delivering on this purpose, and then to monitor them. So that might be, yes, we're going to look at some metrics such as employee turnover or wages and jobs created, but we also want to have some qualitative evaluations of what are you doing to create a corporate culture that encourages dissent and disagreement and so forth, just to make sure that that management teams are putting it into practice. So I do think the board can play a major role in this, seeing it's important, seeing it's a responsibility of the full board, and then also trying to find out ways to monitor and evaluate it.
It's music. It's very good to have your examples. I mean, you're putting very concrete examples behind your arguments, and you have the financial perspective, which is great in this, as for this to become more stronger and more, let's say, widen up the listening capabilities of investors and also board members. So that's great. What you're then doing, it seems to me, is using, and your book is very, it's very comprehensive in its approach. And you see the relation also between the macro and the micro on the enterprise level, but also going to social value, and also the big on the society level. And it seems to me you are trying to cover a vacuum or a missing link a little bit in there by putting financial arguments into both the human side of things, the social and societal side of things, and even gapping towards environment. I mean, to include all this as part of purpose and value creation and productivity. productivity, sustainable productivity over time, and increase productivity by introducing these concepts and these perspectives into the organizations, into the enterprise. There's a lot of things going on at the moment on this, as you know. I mean, EU has a lot of work on this, UN has a lot of work on this, and it seems to me you are touching on the what I call the Adam Smith versus Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman having taken over, the profit drives everything, and you are more into the stakeholder, the society part of things. Is that how you see it? That this is part of a renewal of capitalism or market economy at large?
Absolutely. I'd say it's a renewal. It's also a broadening. So I'd like leaders and investors and policymakers to have a broader view of value. So often when people think about grow the pie, which is the title of the book, they'll think about growing the pie means growing wealth. And they'll say, well, let's grow wealth and then distribute it. But then there's problems with that, because if you grow wealth too much, then maybe you're going to be polluting the environment and so forth. So instead, what I view the pie as is social value. We want to create social value. And that's not just creating wealth, that's creating human capital by providing employees with meaningful work and training and skills development. That's preserving the environment, that's creating value for customers and communities, even if this is not necessarily monetizable, right? And so I think if we think about value as being all these things beyond financial value, I think this will lead to a very different way of doing capitalism. But also the important thing is that if we view the goal of the corporation as being social value, this is not at the expense of financial value. And that's critical, because otherwise there'll be a lot of skeptical investors and business leaders who think, no, we still need to generate profits for our investors. Profits play an important role in society. We can't just keep thinking about climate change and treating our work as well. That's just not commercially realistic. But what I'm saying is it is commercially realistic for two reasons. Number one, I have the evidence to suggest that in the long term, this will pay off because you're going to have more productive employees, more loyal customers. And number two, when you think about putting purpose into practice, you don't need to be all things to all people. There's certain things that you could choose to put less emphasis on because this is not actually critical to your purpose. And that is really important, because what we see with some companies is that they try to get on the bandwagon of every social issue that they see going. So before the pandemic, it was climate change. Then when Mr. Floyd was murdered, it was then the Black Lives Matter. And so they'll swing in the wind and try and do everything. And obviously I care about all of those things. I care about climate change and I care about diversity. But if you are, let's say, a train company, maybe the best way that you create value is making sure the trains run on time, right? Because a really great transport network that connects people to their jobs, their friends and family. So maybe the first thing you need to do is just to be excellent at your core business in terms of running that smoothly. Then you should also make sure that you don't pollute and you don't mistreat your workers and so on. But I do think the value of purpose is that it allows you to have this priority structure. And before you think about, well, should I donate 10 million euros or 10 million kroner to this charity, maybe the first thing you do is to focus on the core business. For me as a professor, I think the main way that I add value to my students is through improving my teaching, to make sure my teaching is relevant, it's up to date, it has real world examples, it's not theoretical. That adds far more value than the fact that I bike to my lectures rather than taking an Uber. And so I think sometimes when companies think about social value, they think about a lot of these eye-catching public relations initiatives. They don't think enough about excellence in their core business as being a way in which they're serving society.
Very, very, very interesting. Very well, and then very enlightening for me and for us listening. If you take that further, because we are where we are, and as you say, maybe some people are open and curious about this change in perspective, but many people are not, and most are not, and we're still lagging. Will you not come to the point where the concept of GDP, which is a construct and has served us for a while, and has been a compass, or at least a guideline for what is growth? what is value in a strict sense, and where we see that the GDP as such does not serve us as well anymore, because it was a construct, but it doesn't take into account everything that we've been speaking about and everything that is the reality. And there's a lot of movement there. Don't you see that? Don't you feel that there will be a time where GDP will have to, if it wants to keep its role as a compass, will have to be renewed to internalize some of these things that we've been discussing? And do you see a movement in that direction, that we can see things going on? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so certainly GDP is limited. It doesn't capture many of the important dimensions of value that I mentioned. However, I think there's sometimes people who get too radical and go too far the other extreme. I know that you weren't saying this, Trond, but others say, let's completely scrap GDP. I don't think so, because we can still use it, but we just understand the limitations. Just like with companies, they still report their earnings and their profits, but we as investors know that's not the only thing that we should look at. We should look at other things. So as long as GDP is still measured, but we recognize it's only part of the value of a country, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. We do want to try and measure these other things. We want to measure stuff such as, is it hours worked per week, or measures of equality of opportunity, or measures of skills development, and we want to put them alongside GDP. But I think the difficult thing is that some people say, well, let's enhance GDP by adding to that measures of people happiness. But the thing is you can't measure people happiness. You can't add that to GDP to have a different number. It's just like when you choose a job, right? You don't add to the salary a monetary value of how nice the people are. Like, we consider those two things separately. When we choose a job, think about the salary, think about the camaraderie and the colleagues, and we think about those as two different dimensions. We don't try to have this one big all-encompassing dimension, which takes into account salary and career prospects and the friendliness of the workers. We have many different things. So I think the solution is not to try to add more things into GDP and think we're going to have this one unified comprehensive metric. It's instead we're going to have different metrics which cover different aspects of a country, and that's much better than trying to lump one thing together.
These discussions are being had in Davos meetings. It's being had around the world, and as we know, in the Nordics, we have some sort of, let's say, tradition for being perhaps more open to this human part of finance than what is general globally. Do you think the Nordics has a role to play here? Is there a need to have some testing grounds for things and pilots, and should there be more, let's say, initiatives also on the government level or policy level to introduce this? And as you say, not to take away the sharpness eventually of GDP, but to have this balance, to see value and social value in a broader context.
Yes, I think the Nordics, perhaps culturally, have always been about the importance of things beyond financial value. So that's why there's many leaders from the Nordics. So EQT Ventures, as I mentioned previously, they're a Swedish investment company. And again, with everything about investors, one real leading investor is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Norges Bank Investment Management, which I do a lot of work with. And so they really will try to look beyond measures of financial value when evaluating companies. They'll look at long-term horizons. And so what they've done is, on their website, they put a number of position papers which will look at, well, how are they trying to do things, such as evaluating these additional dimensions. And so I think it does start often with investors, because unless investors look beyond financial measures, then any manager who wants to still keep his or her job will think, well, let me focus on financial measures because that's what investors are evaluating me according to. So I think we can learn a lot from the Nordics in terms of how they're evaluating companies as investors and how they're managing companies as in terms of the executives.
In your book, I mean, we still have five minutes, but we have to wind up the conversation. In your book, which is full of examples and full of very good, let's say, inspiration, I would say, to get into this subject. At the end of the book, you have a lot of very concrete recommendations. Would there be, if I ask you, what would be the top 2-3 recommendations you would give to people the managers and leaders sitting at this conference and this webinar, if they should just take away 2-3 things. I mean, there's a lot of things you have said, but I'm just thinking about the end of your book where you have a lot of these very concrete ways of doing things.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So I would say number one for a leader of a business is to define your purpose, define the purpose of the organization, and make sure that the purpose is focused and targeted. So it can't be your purpose is to serve customers and employees and suppliers in the environment. Choose a couple of things that you are going to do. And importantly, a purpose statement is as much about what you don't include as much about what you do include. For example, my own purpose is to use rigorous research to influence the practice of business. It's not to use rigorous research to publish it in the top academic journals and so on, because for me, my purpose is to focus on the practitioner involvement, which is why I love doing things like this, and I would turn down loads of academic keynote speeches to be able to do something like that. Number two is that once you've defined your purpose, what are the ways in which you will monitor it? So there might be some measures that you're going to be looking at. So things like employee turnover, but also other things to monitor which are not quantitative. How are you going to try to figure out what this is? And I think number three is to commit to communicating that purpose to outsiders. So those outsiders could be stakeholders, but they also could be investors. And a critical thing is communication is far more than just reporting. So there's many companies now which have sustainability reports. But again, with the sustainability report, you can only put really the quantitative stuff there. You can't discuss these more qualitative things such as what the workers' concerns are and what you're doing to address them because it's commercially sensitive. And indeed, one example of that was Unilever. So Unilever, as you'll know, got this takeover bid from Kraft a couple of years ago. Normally, when a company gets a takeover bid, it's management who has to defend themselves. But here, it was actually the investors who came to Unilever's defense and said, we don't want you to sell this company because we know that Unilever is worth far more than the offer. And why was that? It's because Unilever had spent a lot of time meeting with their investors to say, well, our true value is not just the financial numbers, it's our sustainable living plan. And so because the investors had buy-in for that purpose, then they were willing to stand up for the company. So three things: define purpose, right? Embed it through knowing what to evaluate and what to monitor and what to measure. And number three, communicate it to the outsiders, to the investors. And that is the system-wide approach that we've been talking about over the past hour. It's not just management, we're embedding it with the workers, and we're also communicating it to our outside investors.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's been great and a pleasure discussing with you. If I could have a couple of recommendations from myself in the end, we will send out an evaluation formula, and I would recommend all of you, because there you can buy Alex's book and buy it and read it. That's my first recommendation. We take nothing for that. We just think it's a very good thing to read, and it will help you in your work. But also, I would recommend for those of you who are interested in making culture your competitive edge, and also in how to monitor these soft things, I mean, please reach out to us. This is what we do. This is what we work with. And we'd love to listen to you, no strings attached, to see if there's anything from your situation that we can help you with. So fill out the evaluation scheme and buy Alex's book and read it. That's my recommendations at the end of this talk. Alex, it's been great. As always, thank you very much. We will try to give you as much space and floor as we can. It's great to have you with your message and your compelling and all your knowledge from a financial point of view into these difficult subjects. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Ron. It's always great to work with you. And thank you so much to all the people who joined the webinar. There's loads of things going on in the world right now. So the fact that you chose to invest 1 hour to spend with us is really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you to all, and thank you for listening in. And let's catch up. Thank you.